Hey guys, so in this month you get access to a new guide on the 5-year-old method. Now the guide is fairly short because the technique is fairly simple. Basically you're just trying to explain your subject in the way that a 5-year-old or someone who doesn't quite understand, doesn't have the same level of educational experience as you would understand it. And the reason that this works is because in trying to teach an idea, you often understand it a lot better. And so it's just this sort of general principle that in trying to articulate how an idea is to someone else, you end up actually articulating it to yourself in a lot better of a way. So today I'm going to offer you a few tips for using this technique and for a few examples for it. So general tips. First one is to speak or write out loud and not just think it in your head. Now, with a lot of these techniques, I try to explain that you can start on paper. So if you're doing, let's say, like a visualization, then a good starting point is to start on paper, draw out kind of what you're thinking that it would look like as a visualization, and then move to the mental zone. And then eventually, as you get more comfortable with the technique, you just do it in your head. So you can just do it in your head in the class, just think of what it would look like or think of an analogy, and you don't have to write it down because it saves more time. But this technique is a little different because if you don't actually articulate it, if you don't actually speak out loud or write on paper, you're not going to do it properly. Because if you're thinking ideas in your head, that's kind of the zone that the understanding is already in, is in your head. And it's very hard to spot incoherence, contradictions in your mental dialogue that are very easy to spot when you're actually writing something down. So for example, if I'm talking about, let's say, linked lists in computer science, and I see it and I'm reading it and I'm like, oh yeah, I understand that, and I'm thinking it to myself, yeah, I completely understand that. And then someone comes up to me and says, can you explain to me what linked lists are? And I start explaining it and I stumble and I don't make any sense. Then that's really what this method is about separating those two different ideas. The ability to think about an idea and feel you understand it in that way, and the ability to effectively explain it to someone else. And this method is about doing the second, and it doesn't work unless you speak out loud or write it on paper. So if you feel weird, speaking to yourself in your room, then you can write it on paper, and that also works. But you have to do one or the other. You can't just think about it in your head and just expect that it'll work. And actually, I've done some case studies with this, and that seems to be the case. That one of the successful people who applied these techniques, his method was, when he was studying for his test, he would just put himself in an empty room and just speak out loud the 5-year-old method, and it worked really well. So the second tip I'm going to offer you is that it's not about a 5-year-old in particular. So I'm calling it the 5-year-old pupil method because the idea is this grand simplification. You could take a really complicated idea and explain it in terms that a 5-year-old would understand. Now, in truth, this isn't really realistic or always helpful because, maybe to take a hard idea down to grade 12 level for you is a lot of work, and you really understand the grade 12 level. Then there isn't that much point bringing it back all the way to the kindergarten level through all those grades and having to explain all those concepts that you really do understand very intuitively. But instead, the method is about bringing it back 2 or 3 steps before where you're at right now. So for example, if you're taking calculus and you're taking an advanced calculus class, then maybe that means for you bringing it back to your first day of calculus. So you could explain it to yourself 3 years ago when you were first learning calculus in those terms. And I stress that you want to try to take it as far as you can go, but you have to be conservative on the time. So if you're working on an idea, to get it down to a kindergarten level, that might take 3 hours, whereas it only takes 10 minutes to do it to a level 3 steps below you. So work on what is most timely, but at the same time, don't just explain it in terms that just you would be able to understand. The whole goal of the method is to oversimplify, to make it easier to understand than you actually need it to be. And one of the powers of this method is that when you start explaining it, when you start actually doing this out loud, when you start explaining it, writing it down on paper, you look for moments where you stumble. You look for moments where you're not actually sure how to explain a certain facet of the idea or concept. And when you reach those moments, that clues you in that you don't actually really understand that in a well-articulated manner. So as I said with the linked list example, if I'm explaining it and then I get to pointers And I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I explain pointers? How do I explain pointers? And you start talking about things, you're like, wait, no, that's not right. It's like this. That shows you that you don't really understand pointers that well. And I'm just using this as a hypothetical example, but it happens all the time that when we start actually explaining things to other people, there's the stuff that we understand easily, and then there's the moments where we trip up. And so those are the ones that you need to look for, and then when you find that moment, bam, you've pinpointed it, you can go back and seek other explanations, you can reinforce it with metaphors and visualizations. So the 5-year-old method is a good way to get kind of a bird's eye view of your understanding of a topic, because when you start to stumble, bam, you identify the key area. And this is something that doesn't happen with the other tactics. So metaphors, visualization, flow-based note-taking, you don't really have a good sense of, okay, this is what I really understand, this is what I don't understand. And that's the power of this technique. So I'll walk you through a quick example. I'm not going to go through the entire thing because I want to keep this video pretty short, and if I were to do it to what I would consider to be a sufficient level, I'd probably be going for about 10 minutes. But I'll just walk you through how I would use this on a net present value calculation in finance. So if you don't know what a net present value calculation is, if you've never taken finance, then hopefully I'll be able to explain it a little bit for you in this little demonstration. And again, I'm focusing less on actually just walking through the technique and showing you kind of the mental heuristic for going through it so you could apply it to your own studies, because I don't need to understand the net present value calculation, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to learn this method of doing it so you can apply it to your own studies. So the textbook definition of a net present value calculation is the sum of all future cash flows applied at a particular discount rate. Now this is sort of a ripe explanation for using this method because there's a lot that someone who, 3 steps below me would not understand. There's, first of all future cash flows. So, okay, so what exactly is that? A discount rate? What is a discount rate? And more importantly, how do you apply a discount rate? So what exactly is this definition saying? So there's a few angles you can tackle it at. One way is to start by going from the bottom up. So I could start by explaining, well, okay, net present value calculation. Why would you want to do a net present value calculation? So if I'm explaining this to a 5-year-old, the first thing he's going to ask me is why? Why are we even talking about this? And so that's a direction you can go at it. You can start by going from the bottom up and saying, okay, well, a net present value calculation is, let's say you're getting money and it's not all at once. It's over a period of time, and over a bunch of periods of time, over a long period of time. And the net present value is figuring out, well, how much is that worth to you? So you know that if you get $100 today, it's worth $100. But what if you get $50 today and $50 in 2 weeks? Is that worth $100? Well, maybe not, because I'd rather have the $100 today than $50 today and $50 in 2 weeks. So the net present value is a way of figuring out how much all these different cash flows, all these different bits of money is worth, even if it's spread out over time. So that's one way of doing it, going from the bottom up and using analogy. Another way is using the top-down method, and this is another way I like doing it. So here, I would take the textbook definition and I would simplify it. So I would split it up and identify parts that are confusing or maybe would not be obvious to someone 3 steps behind me. So for this, that would be, future cash flows. I think that someone 3 steps behind me would understand that, there's money coming in over a period of time. So maybe I'll handle that later. But a big one would be a discount rate and how to apply a discount rate. So I basically take this and then I split it up again. So I get the discount rate and I figure out, okay, well, I'm going to apply the 5-year-old method to the discount rate. How do I explain what a discount rate is? So again, I can also tackle this from the bottom up. I can say, well, why would you use a discount rate? And for me, I would use a discount rate because, as I explained in my previous example, if you have money that's coming in today and money that's coming in a year, obviously you'd rather have the money today because then you can just save it and have it in a year. You have more options if you have it right today. And the discount rate is a measure of how much more you want it today than you want it tomorrow. So if you get $100 today and $100 in 1 year, how much more do you want that $100 today than the $100 in a year? And if, let's say, the discount rate were 50%, then that means that in 1 year from now, you only want that $100 half as much as you want the $100 today. It's only worth half as much to you. And so this is sort of like kind of a more intuitive explanation. So again, we're coming from the bottom up. We're saying why use the discount rate? What's the purpose of it? So that's one way to get at it. Or we could break it down again. We could say discount rate, and we could say, all right, well, it involves a calculation about things that are growing. And so you can go down even further. So I could keep doing this and go down into even more detail and talk about application and splitting this up. But I don't want to waste too much more of your time. But the goal of this whole 5-year-old method, the goal of splitting it up and doing this, is so that you have a really strong understanding. So just to summarize, make sure that you do all of your things out loud. So don't just think it in your head. Write it down or speak out loud. Both work really well. 2, the goal isn't to get it all the way to a 5-year-old, so don't feel like you failed if you couldn't explain it to your kindergarten cousin or something like that. And the goal is to go a few steps before where you're at right now. So not just easy enough for you to understand it, but easy enough for you to understand it, let's say, 2 years ago. Finally, you want to pinpoint moments where you're stumbling in explanation. Look for things that you find difficult to explain. And if you find difficulty explaining something, then that probably clues you in that you don't really understand it that well. And when you're actually going through the method, I've listed 2 ways you can kind of conceptualize how to take this textbook definition and then break it down into the 5-year-old method. So one way is from the bottom up. So you say, why are we talking about this? What is it about? And then kind of build it up there from a simpler explanation. The other way is to take the definition itself and cut it into pieces and figure out what are the most confusing parts of that definition and then explain those. So those are 2 methods to do the actual method and 3 little tips to get it started. So I really hope that you consider trying this in a 30-day trial, because it's easy to talk about these methods and actually think, oh yeah, I'll do that with my studies. And it's another thing to actually implement it deliberately so it becomes a habit. So I hope that you consider doing that. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Good luck on this tactic, and I'll see you on the other side.